All right, so we are now joined by Lily Geismer. She is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. She's also the author of Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. And her latest book, which we'll be talking about today, is Left Behind, The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. Lily, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's just dive into your book. Your new book, Left Behind, looks at the legacy of the wing of the Democrats that, we now call the New Democrats. And this is a group that sort of famously includes former President Bill Clinton. And I think just to start, I do want to get into the history of how the New Democrats came to be, but I want to start by asking you kind of a broader question about how the New Democrats really saw the role of government in fighting poverty and inequality. So, Bill Clinton famously enacts welfare reform and deregulates the financial sector. And, I think watchers of the Jacobin show are probably pretty familiar with the idea of, say, like corporate Democrats or neoliberal Democrats. But I think that's something that's really interesting about your book is you point out that just calling them corporate Democrats or saying that they're Republican light is really only part of the story, or it really doesn't get at the whole picture, because regardless of the policy outcomes of the New Democrats, you point out that they really did see themselves in some ways as continuing the legacy of FDR and the New Deal. So I want to start by asking you this. You say that the New Democratic approach can be summed up with the mantra, doing well by doing good. So explain the slogan and how it sort of represents both a continuation of some aspects of New Deal liberalism, but also in other ways, a significant departure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And it shows such sort of great engagement with the book and its argument. I mean, a critical part of it was to try to understand this idea of sort of saying that Bill Clinton is just like the Republicans or the Democrats, this kind of lumping together of those types of things. And I think it's absolutely true that in many ways, the outcomes are similar, and that many of the things that sort of Reagan and the Reagan wing of the Republican Party and Reagan's administration tried to do actually occurred under Bill Clinton. And the classic examples are welfare and deregulation. But I think this critical question around sort of what is the role of government was one thing that I really wanted to understand. And in some ways, the book is actually trying to understand like a kind of democratic version of neoliberalism, which I see actually embodied in this phrase and this idea of doing well by doing good, which is really the idea of there's still a belief in government. So unlike the kind of traditional sort of Reagan or Milton Friedman view of kind of you like government leaves and you like let the market do its thing, they still believe in an idea of kind of government as a catalyst for connecting the public and private sectors. And that's kind of this idea of the doing well and the doing good and putting them together. But in another sort of important point is that they come to believe that the market they sort of still have this faith in kind of broad New Deal liberal ideals of kind of equality, helping people in need, which are kind of critical aspects of both the New Deal and the Great Society, but believe that the market can achieve those types of things. And so you instead of like and how I describe this in the book is like, so going back to New Deal, and I think this is often the sort of piece of where the New Deal itself is so complicated. Like the New Deal believed in markets too, but they believed that sort of, they believed in public and private partnerships, but they really believed in this idea of kind of keeping that the market does one that achieves economic growth, and that the government comes in with kind of compensatory or supplementary welfare programs. Like the Clinton New Democrat approach is that those two things come together, and that the market can sort of serve that function, and you can bring in the market to kind of to achieve what a sort of robust welfare state once did. So you instead of providing cash payments, it's jobs and entrepreneurship. That's the kind of thinking of this type of approach.
So let's talk a little bit about how the New Democrats kind of came to be. You trace this back to the creation of a kind of mysterious group called the Democratic Leadership Council. What exactly is the DLC, and how did this group sort of help propel the New Democrats to power?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because to many people they were sort of at the center of American politics for a brief period, but have kind of fallen out of fashion. And they actually, the story actually even goes deeper than the DLC to this kind of iterations of Democrats coming into office in the 1970s and 1980s, and there was this obsessive quest to figure out a name for them. So the first name is the Watergate Babies, and then because they come into office, and then They're actually called the neoliberals for a while. So they're like the first neoliberals. And then my favorite name is the Atari Democrats, which I wrote a piece for Jacobin about several years ago. But then it becomes New Democrats under the DLC. And they're a group of people. It's a combination of members of Congress who are part of this kind of Watergate baby group that kind of thought the Democratic Party was sort of out of date. Like one of their big mantras was the kind of they started with the solutions of the 70s can't solve the problems. The problems of the 30s can't solve the problems of the 70s, and they update that to the problems of the 80s. But they believe in the kind of old style of New Deal. The kind of New Deal liberalism is not working, both in terms of its political economy and also in terms of its coalitions, and especially are concerned about the Democratic Party's feels of the Democratic Party is too beholden to special interest groups, especially to the labor movement. That's one group. And then there's also this group of kind of moderate Southern Democratic governors, people like Chuck Robb of Virginia, who really believe that the party is what's hurting the Democrats is the fact that they're not trying to win over kind of moderate white Southerners, like the kind of people who voted for them. And I should say their emergence, they come together actually at the 1984 Democratic Convention, and initially is where they had their first meeting. And there's this idea that the kind of Democratic Party is in shambles, and they're really frustrated with this kind of the decision or the nomination of Walter Mondale, who they see as kind of this like real sort of failed Democrat who's too close to the labor movement, and that they then decide to sort of form this group called the Democratic Leadership Council. So it's primarily politicians, actually solely politicians, and overwelmingly white male politicians. Mostly from the South and the West. They do have Dick Gephardt's their first head because he's like from Missouri, and that seems like that's diversification. But then they get into a lot of trouble for how a lot of people call them kind of this, like that it's like a return of the Dixiecrats. Right. So they do make efforts to kind of diversify, but their real goal, so that's kind of the inside baseball part of them. Their real goal is to kind of transform the Democratic Party. And they really want to kind of, and it's this idea of New Democrats that we're going to like remake who the party is. And within that idea is to make it much more, to make it in line with this kind of constituency of appealing to sort of swing voters, especially former sort of moderates who are seeming to drift toward the Republican Party, but also to remake the priorities of the party. And so by 1990, like one of their core mantras is like, we have to create opportunity, expand opportunity, not government. And how you do that is through market-oriented means. Right. And especially in this kind of new economy tech sectors of tech, finance, and trade. So that's really their sort of vision.
Yeah, so let's dive into some of those policies now, because you had just mentioned the New Democrats really started to turn away from labor, not accidentally, but actively, right? And we really think of organized labor as kind of the backbone of the New Deal coalition. But then, of course, as you mentioned, by the 90s, the New Democrats are sort of actively seeking to undermine the influence of labor in the Democratic Party. Can you say a little bit more about what motivated this turn away from labor, and then what they did to kind of push the labor movement out?
Yeah, I mean, so there's this was the part that was sort of, I actually would say was the most surprising to me, because I'd written in my first book about this kind of the reorientation of the Democrats towards more sort of suburban knowledge workers. And I hadn't realized how deliberate that was actually until I worked on this project. But a lot of it was this idea that kind of the labor movement was dragging the party down, and kind of both in terms of its like sort of in trying to sort of tailor electoral strategies that way, that kind of making labor the kind of the backbone, which it had been for so long. And I mean, some of it was this idea that there was too many backroom dealings, and that like the sort of AFL-CIO had become this like bloated bureaucracy that they opposed. That was part of the issue, that there was like it wasn't like transparent enough, and this in the kind of some of the older relationships. That was a key piece of it. But the other side of it actually has to do, I mean, it's economic, but they kind of see that that manufacturing and industry is in the past, and that like really what is going to sort of save the Democrats and save the economy is to turn towards the new economy, and so that is in sectors that are non-unionized, and so that's a kind of critical piece too. So this kind of coalition question of kind of how do you capture trying to sort of tailor a Democratic Party coalition around labor is not going to win elections. But then the other side is like the American economy cannot be wedded to heavily unionized sectors. And so that's really what's drawing their this particular strategy and approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that brings up that another key part of the New Democrats platform was kind of embracing free trade, right? Like Clinton famously pushes through NAFTA in the 1990s. Maybe talk a little bit about that kind of macroeconomic component a little more, because I think that's really interesting. And you know, when I was reading your book, it kind of seemed like the perfect example of how, you know, the New Democrats may have started with some really good intentions. Like they weren't just trying, at least from what I understand, they weren't just trying to, you know, enrich corporations and, you know, destroy American jobs, although obviously, you know, many decades later, that's clearly what happened. But they really built a specific industrial policy. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, no, and I appreciate that. I mean, that's one of the things I really wanted to understand is like, what was their thinking and motivation? I think so often like there's this focus on just like strategy and that like, I mean, so this is one of the core kind of things I wanted to sort of get at in the book is that there's this idea that like the embrace of the market, and it's sort of in cynical terms was like Bill Clinton. So things like NAFTA were just all about getting elected. Like they just wanted to get power and get elected. And like there wasn't anything actually ideological about this or an understanding. And I actually like really wanted to think about what were the kind of intents here and like to get at their words, they believed that this was going to do something. And I think especially, I mean, so in the really beginning in the 1970s, they begin to see the sort of wing of the Democratic Party begins to kind of see that the future lies in globalization and trade. And that's the roots to kind of solving the nation's economic problems. So sort of emerging from the kind of the recessions of the 1970s, and that you sort of invest in those areas. And so they're actually big believers in industrial policy, but an industrial policy approach that is focused on things like the tech sector. Right. So it's like it's not going back to like they sort of, I mean, there's this a lot of the theories are based on, and this is where it gets like really nitty gritty, but on economists like Lester Thurow, who believed in kind of sunrise versus sunset industries, and so manufacturing is like a sunset industry, and that can be sent overseas. Like all of that kind of manufacturing can happen somewhere in the global South. But that the U.S. should sort of focus its policies primarily on these kind of more knowledge-oriented work. And another actually critical person who promotes these ideas is actually Robert Reich in the 1970s, 1980s, and is very much sort of this is the way. This is kind of an inevitability, and the United States needs to like get to sort of save the economy is to get on track. And this is going to help. I mean, I think the roots of this also comes to this idea, that is a relentless focus of Democratic Party policy since the 1970s and 80s, but is on worker retraining. So you retrain former workers, and then they can sort of get these sort of more knowledge-oriented jobs for the future. And that's really the kind of thinking of this approach.
Right. So another major focus of your book is microfinance, right? So I want to zero in on that for a second. Why did Bill Clinton and the New Democrats kind of gravitate to this idea of like microloans and micro enterprise? And how does this idea of micro enterprise really exemplify the New Democrats' approach to dealing with domestic economic inequality?
Yeah. So the interesting sort of one of the things the book looks at is this effort to kind of use microfinance, which we traditionally think of as a tool of international sort of economic development in the United States. And this doesn't I guess the flash forward is it doesn't work, but so that's why it's not told a lot. But the beginning in the 1980s, Bill Clinton brings Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, who's seen as kind of the father of micro enterprise, to the U.S. And this idea of kind of giving small loans to poor people so they can start their own businesses. And I think there's a couple of things. Like one is it's this growing faith in entrepreneurship, and this kind of idea of kind of an entrepreneurial economy, which is also what they're promoting at the kind of macro level for, that's sort of at the heart of kind of new economy thinking. But at the same time, it's this notion of sort of helping poor people, both that will sort of sustain economic growth. And so Bill Clinton brings it to the Mississippi or the Arkansas Delta, when he's governor, with the idea that this can kind of stimulate the economy, but also help poor people become more self-sufficient. And I think it really is at the heart of kind of that that kind of thinking that like this is where the market itself can do good, that it's helping it's helping people find a sense of sort of self-sufficiency. And actually there is this kind of core part of particularly Bill Clinton's thinking, and this is also what he sort of the ideas of welfare to work too, which is like in the psychological power of having a job. And that becomes important. But I think one of the things actually is really critical, and this goes back to the question of union of labor as well, is so one of the reasons that the sort of places like the Arkansas Delta were in such trouble and needed programs like this is that they had lost their all of their they were mostly like one factory towns, and the factories had gone overseas.
Right.
And it turned out that many people actually didn't want to start. Like there was this notion of like the poor as entrepreneur, and that like sort of like turn your hobby into a business. So if you like love making coffee cake, like you can go, then that should be your business. And that's like, that maybe does work for a few people, but the problem, one of the things that came up was that like a lot of people actually like the stability of a wage
right.
Job. I mean, they're like the things that come for having a job where you have you have stable employment is really critical. And that's what's not provided if you're your own boss. So there's this idea of selling like empowerment through having your own business, but that doesn't do that. And I think another thing is it obscures the critical class differences between like it's sort of like anyone can be Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, who become these like heroes in the 1990s, but like that's actually not, that they're not the same thing as this poor Black woman who's selling her coffee cake in Arkansas Delta. So that's some of the kind of limitations to it. So it's that I mean, or I would say like critical limitation to it.
So speaking of like these ideas of empowerment and choice, I want to ask you also about the New Democrats' approach to education, because, I feel like Democrats historically have sort of thought of themselves or represented themselves as like defenders of public education and allies of teachers' unions. And obviously, compared to the Republicans, that has usually been true. But an interesting thing about the New Democrats is that they were like big proponents of charter schools. So, and again, like I think that this goes back to kind of these notions of empowerment and choice, right? So can you talk a little bit about why they were so interested in charter schools, and then how the New Democrats sought to remake education?
Yeah. So and it is this idea of like education is kind of this critical kind of New Deal value. And I think another kind of critical part of that is this belief in kind of meritocracy, as a sort of core idea. But there's this long-standing history of kind of, and I think it also is this question of it's a public good to some degree, and sort of something that is from the public sector. But the New Democrats actually are the earliest proponents of charter schools. And I think there's often this, this is one thing that when I worked on the book, didn't fully understand, is like we tend to think about charter schools more as a kind of Republican solution. But in the 80s and 90s, the Republicans are really pushing vouchers, which they've now come back to. But that was kind of the kind of core idea of kind of what is choice. And the Democrat version, and this goes back to this kind of idea of what government can do, is that they're opposed to vouchers because that's like a fully privatized, that's sort of a privatized system. And this is still like sort of working within the public sector, but giving people this more of a sense of like your own individual freedom. And that goes to the same thing of kind of promoting entrepreneurship in the same way that you can kind of have a sense of empowerment by choosing what school you want to come into. Another critical piece of it actually is that, so a huge aspect of the New Democrat philosophy around government is this idea of what is at the time called sort of reinventing government, but bringing in techniques of the private sector and the market to make government more efficient. And that's also the thinking around charters, that charters will kind of use these kind of tools of the private sector, of more accountability, more competition. So, I mean, the thinking on charters is that like public schools would have to compete with them. And then that would sort of make everything, make a better system. Right. And that's the thinking, that's sort of a lot of the kind of philosophical idea of kind of why New Democrats and people like Bill Clinton push this. So beginning in the 1990s, and they still believe it's still public charters, and they actually are not full advocates of the kind of private management program. I mean, the ones that are sort of for profit. So it's still like a nonprofit system, but that's a lot of the kind of thinking. And it is a really interesting question because I mean, the teachers unions actually increased in their power within the Democratic Party in the 1990. I think they're the biggest constituency of the biggest union constituency at the 1992 convention. So they actually hold power. And teachers unions, and so there's a question there of like this kind of sacrificing of that particular constituency around this issue. But the other group that's really does come to really advocate charters and is a critical partner in the Clinton administration and promotion of it is the tech sector and Silicon Valley, who really promote and advocate this idea.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like as we've been talking, I've been hinting a little bit that I am rather skeptical of a lot of these new Democratic policies, right? But I also want to point out, lots of people think of the Clinton era as a time of economic prosperity. He famously had a rare budget surplus. Lots of people, I think, point out that during the 90s, like inflation and unemployment was low. And people point out that the poverty rate actually went down during his tenure. So I guess the question is like, what do these broad indicators miss? And if you, looking back at all of the policies that we really have just gone through, like what is the scorecard here? Did they work at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. So one, and and as for maybe the conversation and as reading the book, like my skepticism is there too on so a lot of these programs. But I want to say one thing is like they're not a lot. So there are a couple things. Like one is they're not all bad ideas in and of themselves. Like it's just that they can't replace the welfare state. And so that's one thing that I like really want to emphasize. But I think the other question in this, what you've identified is that that's the classic retort that I have received from New Democrats. Like that is the kind of, or sort of people who are in the more sort of more mainstream Democrats. And that's kind of the story of the 90s. And it is this interesting idea because I'm so intrigued with this nostalgia for the 90s.
Right.
But I think some of it is some of that. The issue with it is that's true that, and this goes to this idea that like overall growth did well. And this idea like, so the doing well by doing good, like the economy did well. But the issue that I see sort of coming out of these questions and on the kind of like is that what a lot these programs did is to leave poor and low income people in a much more vulnerable position later for two different reasons. One is the issue of the removal, so welfare, the efforts to kind of remove to replace the welfare system with work and entrepreneurship. Another critical one that I look at in the book is around public housing, and to replace public housing with a kind of a more mixed income housing, and then also to kind of promote home ownership among marginalized groups. That coupled with, so you have all of these removals of the kind of what was left at that point of the kind of traditional social safety net, also with deregulation.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing is kind of this relying on the market at a moment and relying on the economy and sectors like tech and trade and all of these other things. Like the economy itself was changed dramatically through Clinton era policies from the beginning of the 1990s to the end of the 1990s. And so with that, it left people by less than a decade later, much, much more vulnerable to both to predation. I mean,
right.
From companies. And that's another thing that like the selling like corporations can do good and can help people. That is both sort of limited, but also is has a predatory dimension to it. But then generally just that the private sector cannot replace what the public sector can and what government can do. And I think that has been very much borne out over the course of the last sort of 15 years.
Right.
And so that's what we've seen. So it's sort of in the moment of like 2000 and, 2001 when Bill Clinton left office, that wasn't fully apparent. But that becomes very apparent, like, I guess 6 years later.
Right.
So that is some of what I see happening. And then I think the other issue that's really important is the ways in which this then alienated, I mean, the selling of the market to do good and going around the country and sort of promoting this idea. I think to many people it didn't see the roots or results of that, and it alienated a lot of people from the Democratic Party itself, and sort of no longer either were not voting or then come to actually vote for Republicans and for Trump. So that's another critical piece that I think it also like. This is this interesting moment because it's the story of kind of Democratic Party dominance and sort of like it's when, the Democrats capture the presidency, but at the same time that it sort of sublimated a lot of these other tensions within the kind of Democratic Party coalition.
So I think then I want to wrap up by bringing the legacy of the New Democrats kind of to the present, because again, as we've been sort of discussing, I think over the last 2 decades, we're seeing more and more people, not just on the left, but even members of what we might think of as the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, now increasingly questioning some of these fundamental assumptions that the New Democrats have been pushing. I'm wondering, number one, do you see the New Democrats' influence continuing to persist and continuing to shape the Democratic Party? And then I guess the final question is, what can we do to start rolling back or reversing some of these failed policies and just the inequality that some of these New Democrat policies exacerbated?
Yeah, I mean, it's this interesting one because I think culturally the New Democrats don't hold the same power within the Democratic Party. So I think like one thing, I mean, the DLC closes in 2011. There's been this kind of, especially kind of marginalization of Bill Clinton from the party's kind of big sort of marquees at the conventions or whatever it is. But so I think that on that level, like there's not the same kind of cultural hold that they once had. I think the policies, I mean, this is this thing that like the policies have persisted in various different ways. And I think one thing is I think that very much during the Obama administration, there was a kind of celebration of a lot of these ideas and sort of things like entrepreneurship and various different other in tech and all of those, that is kind of a critical piece. So I think that what's happened is like, there's no longer this kind of selling of like, the market can do good. Like that's not like, I think the sort of big candidates have like learned not to say those kinds of things in some capacity, that they don't hold the same kind of power that they once did. So that has gone away, but I don't see there's not the kind of replacement in various different other things. So I think that there's still this commitment to growth that growth can do. Like we sort of look to economic growth as the solution to a lot of problems that has persisted. Mm-hmm. And so that's one area. I think there's another question that like a lot of the kind of actual people in many of the kind of the people from both the DLC and from the Clinton administration now do hold positions in the Biden and powerful positions in the Biden administration. So this is, I'm answering it like a 6-part question. Short answer. I'm sorry to go on.
No, that's great.
One thing I think one area that I see the kind of concern, like the kind of return and resurgence, is this question around how do you build an electoral coalition? And so this tension that was a fight in the 1980s around the Democratic Party about, do you focus on trying to win over like moderate kind of swing voters in the suburbs, or do you try to really kind of center on marginalized groups? That tension has really reemerged. And I think one thing that I look to is kind of see happening is like things like the midterms is Biden and the kind of mainstream of the Democratic Party going back to the idea of like, we have to win over moderate Democrats and sort of swing voters as the kind of key to the electoral coalition. And that's a dangerous legacy to some capacity from this. But the other side of like what we can do to change that, like what I see as sort of places to change it, is a couple of things. I mean, one is to work on reinstituting certain forms of regulation.
Yeah.
And to sort of think hard about kind of this notion. I mean, a lot of these policies come from this idea that you could sort of erase the boundary between the public and private sectors. And the efforts to kind of reinstitute those boundaries, I think, are really critical. So efforts to kind of reinstitute and expand actually many of those kinds of things. To not think that the market can do good. So that's some of the critical parts, but also to really shore up the power of things like the labor movement and so seeing that happening to me. I mean, that's sort of really critical to sort of understanding. So the other piece of this is the story of the kind of marginalization of labor from having a voice both in the party, but like that made me think like sort of nationally. And I think that sort of in really sort of encouraging that to any capacity is really critical to kind of addressing some of the kind of core forms of inequality that became exacerbated in the period that I look at.
Right. All right. Lily Geismer's book, again, is Left Behind: The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. We will link that down below. Lily, thank you so much for your time. It was good to see you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.